Good afternoon, everybody. This is Truth Seeker. Well, to begin with, I went to my grandson's swimming lesson today, and so I had started a video and I scrambled and lost it. Probably all the better, but I don't want to take over the house. My dear wife. I don't want to have her tiptoeing around the house while I'm trying to make a video. It's not fair of me. Although she really spices up things. She's a spunky person. Always loved that about her. We're celebrating our 40th year this year. We met on July 30th in 1978 at the Bible Students General Convention in Albion, Michigan. And I was 23 years old. She was 22. And we hit it off immediately. She was the first girl that I could just feel normal about when I was talking with her. Normally, gorgeous people, gorgeous girls in general, would intimidate me. I was extremely shy. It might not seem like that today, but back then, in those days, I didn't have a whole lot of self-esteem, and I was a little bit on the shy side, and yet I found it really, really easy to talk with her. We were engaged 3 weeks after we met, and I proposed. I didn't plan on it, but we were walking around Washington, D.C. She lived in Northern Virginia, and I went down for a visit. Oh, I'm sorry about the noise in the background. They're building a house. They were having saws and stuff. We may get chased in with the noise, but like I said, I didn't want to run my wife out of the house, so I have chosen to do this outdoors. But yes, this is our the weekend 40 years ago that we met. It was July 30th, which is Monday, but I took today off to be with her and to just rest. I'm tired. I've been really worked quite a bit. We got a lot going on, and it's very difficult for me to keep up. So we watched my grandson swim this morning. He's taking swimming lessons, a little 3-year-old, and he just takes to the water like a duck, and he's in the goldfish swimming lessons, and it's great being a grandparent. He's a wonderful little boy. I just love him to death. It's going to be really hard when life changes for us to separate ourselves. We have a very close relationship with them, and my younger daughter, her husband, and our whole family. We're just this wonderful little unit that I love so much. My older daughter, her really common law husband. They're amazing. I just a very, 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 very lucky man. But anyway, after goldfish lessons, we came back home, and now it's 86 degrees, 96% humidity, and I'm out here with an umbrella. Maybe that's why the camera lighting is a little dark. And hopefully not too much background noise, so let's keep our fingers crossed. My last video, okay, I talked about a new beginning. The Bible students movement the depth and degree of loyalty to Charles Russell cannot be underestimated. I just watched a video this morning when I first woke up. It's about an hour long video. I'm going to link to it. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a John Cedars style critique of this video at some point, and I'm going to go through it point by point because I don't. Obviously, it's a video on the history of the Chicago Bible students, and the Chicago Bible students historically through my life was the largest Bible student ecclesia in the United States. The big ones being Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, and New York. And of those four, New York was the smallest. I grew up in the New York class. You'd think that being the largest city in the United States and one of the largest cities in the world, that we would have the largest ecclesia. But see, the Bible students movement was particularly attractive to the Polish, and there was a huge Polish population in Chicago. You know, I see the lighting's a little poor, and I don't know what I'm going to do about that. Maybe if I sit closer. But then you have to look at me more. Anyway, so there was a great deal of appeal to the Polish ethnicity for some reason. I would say the majority of Bible students in the United States were of Polish ethnic background. So I think that can be one of the factors that attributed to why Chicago was the largest Bible students ecclesia. Los Angeles was a big class. I don't know much about their history. Maybe they have, like Chicago. Chicago is a very proud ecclesia, and they are very much tied into their heritage as Bible students. So they have a video that they put on about an hour long of the history of the 75th and celebrating 75 years of the Chicago ecclesia. And it had some interesting stuff in it that I didn't know. Of course, it's very biased toward the Bible student side. But they became independent of Watchtower in 1933. And historically, the Chicago ecclesia, even during Charles Russell's time, was a large ecclesia of 500 to 600. They kept tallies. Apparently, there was a tally of 600 memorial takers in 1915. The year before Russell passed away. I guess the numbers declined a little as a result of the disappointment over 1914. So the 1916 memorial numbers were smaller, and this was even before Charles Russell died. They were down in the 500s somewhere, but that's still a pretty large ecclesia or congregation. The ecclesia remained about that size through the 20s, apparently, because by 1933 they still had over 500 members in their ecclesia. Again, I'm going to link to their video, and they had a discussion within the class. Apparently, there was some dissenting from Watchtower within the body of elders in Chicago. This is probably one of the reasons why Rutherford eventually, I think it was 1935, did away with the body of elders, because each class had its own body of elders, and they were elected independently. Each class initially, or Bible students' ecclesia, was initially autonomous, and they elected their own body of elders. Of course, during Russell's day, they all elected Russell their pastor, and so they had that common central link to Watchtower and to Russell being the pastor of all Bible students. Rutherford was never that way, and so that's why he had to make the organization the center focus of the Bible students movement, because he couldn't carry it off, what Russell did. But their bias is pretty strong. Apparently, in Chicago, what happened was this dissent word got back to Watchtower in Brooklyn, and Rutherford sent a representative out, somebody by the name of Oral. I don't know who he is. He was instructed to hold a business meeting and to tip the tables. He invited a number of foreign-speaking classes from the region to participate in this business meeting, and instructed them to vote the Watchtower along with as Watchtower directed, according to the video. And so the tables were stacked, and apparently this didn't sit well with a number of the Bible students there, especially attending this business meeting. And so what happened was a number of key Bible student elders in that class, Ernest Wylam, I knew him, Irving Foss, I knew him, Morehouse, I knew him. He wore a funny goatee type pointy beard, no sideburns, just a mustache and beard around, pointed. He's very distinctive. I'll show photos of him later. But he was a key elder there at that time. He went back to Russell's time. And they apparently had gone out during the business meeting and found a meeting hall, and then came back to the business meeting and said, we've had enough, essentially. I had enough of this clowning around. We've got a new meeting location for anybody who wants to meet with us. We're going to be holding a meeting next Sunday. Now, apparently this occurred in 1933. Out of the 500 or so, they lamented the speaker during this documentary style video talk that was given celebrating the 75th anniversary of Chicago. Bible students lamented that only 60 showed up, so that's only 10%, or a little more than 10% of that ecclesia left Watchtower, at least at that time, and formed the nucleus of what became the Chicago Bible Students Ecclesia. Again, as I was a child and growing up, the Chicago Bible Students were the largest ecclesia in the United States. I think they boasted somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 members. So I assume, and it wasn't said, but I assume that during subsequent years, now I know for a fact that Bible students were leaving Watchtower through the 30s and into the 40s. I know Jack McCauley, and I'll show a picture of Jack McCauley, was a ordained minister listed in the Watchtower ordained ministers list in the yearbook every year until about 1939, and then his name is missing. I assume that's about the time he left Watchtower. So then through the 30s, there were Bible students that were leaving and finding these classes. Now, the Dawn, its main function was initially they put together a series of broadcasts that had been initially sponsored by the Watchtower when Norman Woodworth and John Dawson were members of the Watchtower and members of the Bethel family. They put on a radio series called Frank and Ernest. Now, nowhere on Watchtower's historical information. I'd actually been to the headquarters of Watchtower, and they have a little museum there, and they talk about WBBR, and I don't see anything there that mentioned anything about Frank and Ernest on any of the programming, but of course I wouldn't expect that. I think they'd be very careful to whitewash that out of their history. However, I did notice that John Reed was on one of the programs. Apparently, I think John Reed sang. I know they had musical performances. I know Norman Woodworth played trombone in the WBBR orchestra, and they had musical segments on their radio station, and Reed was on the program, and they had one of the programs where Reed shared the program with Fred Franz. And so both names were on there. Now, Reed was one of the elders that dissented from Chicago. So there was Morehouse, Reed, Foss, and who else did I say? I can't remember now. But there were Wylam. There were a number. Wylam, I believe, was a pilgrim speaker during Russell's time. I know him. He wore a little French beanie. He eventually ended up in Florida. I think for a while he was living in my grandparents' driveway. He and his wife, she was quite a rotund person, let's put it that way. She had difficulty moving around. I knew them when they were quite elderly. He also had the beard that was trimmed sort of in a sort of a fancy way, and I remember he wore like a beanie, like a French beanie cap of, you know what I mean? I don't know what they call those things, but they're French. The French cap, and you see like French artists wear them or whatever. He used to wear that. He and his wife parked their trailer in my grandparents' driveway, and they just stayed. Now, my grandfather, he wasn't one. He would speak his mind, and after broiling about it a while, he finally told the brother Wylam that his welcome was overdue, and they had to move their trailer somewhere else. But yeah, I can picture Grandpa doing that. I remember that story. But yeah, they apparently did that with a number of brethren. I think they eventually ended up in St. Petersburg. I remember them being there, and I don't know if that's where he eventually passed on. I know a lot of old Bible students moved down to Florida in their retirement years. George Wilson, who was a key Bible student. He also did Frank and Ernest with Woodworth in the early 30s. And the Frank and Ernest was done, and I think I said this in the last video. I showed, I think, a copy of the Dawn magazine. Frank and Ernest was a question and answer format radio program on the Bible, and their main mission was to serve as, hey, all you disenfranchised Bible students, we're here. We're forming a new movement. It was a new beginning for them, and the Frank and Ernest program probably did more toward regathering the movement than any other single effort. And Woodworth was the spearhead for that. He was the front and the face for that. He was well noted. He was well connected at Watchtower. His cousin was Clayton Woodworth. Norman Woodworth, he'd been directly disfellowshipped by Rutherford himself, so Rutherford knew him. They went on their own, and Woodworth, again, I mentioned this before, joined a PBI class. Now the PBI wasn't real big on doing a witness, and this is where the Dawn probably differed than the other organizations. First off, why most of the brethren found it difficult, they knew about the Layman's Home Missionary, but Layman's Home Missionary were pretty adamant that the door to the high calling was closed, that Paul S. Johnson, PSL Johnson, who actually was mentioned in the last, I was surprised, was mentioned in the last Watchtower's yearbook to be published. 100 years ago today, at the very end of the publication, they mentioned PSL Johnson and his and the trouble that he raised for Rutherford in the early days of Rutherford's presidency. Well, PSL Johnson went on to start the Layman's Home Missionary. And I think they were quite, fairly successful as an organization, but they didn't believe that again, I'm using Bible student nomenclature, door to the high calling was still open. That was always a big issue with Bible students. That differentiated those who still hung on to Russell's teachings, but believed that they weren't part of the 144,000, and those who still believed that the harvest work was going on. And that's what the Dawn taught, that the harvest work was still going on, and that the door to the high calling was still open. And that's what caused it. It was an organization that allowed those that were disenfranchised from the Watchtower to join a reinvigorated Bible students movement. I remember my family's story. My grandmother, she married in the 1920s. Now, my great-grandparents emigrated from Scotland, my maternal great-grandparents, and they began, again, I may have mentioned the story that they had met the purser of the steamship Columbia in 1909, who was a Bible student, and he directed them to start meeting with, I got a hornet, start meeting at with the Bible students in Brooklyn. They had just, the Watchtower had just moved to Brooklyn in 1909. So that's how they got connected with Russell and with the Bible students. But when Russell died and Rutherford took over, there's something about that. They didn't even wait for the trouble. They just didn't like Rutherford. And very quickly after Rutherford became president, they left meeting with the Bible students. And they didn't want to meet with PSL Johnson because they didn't like what he had to say, that he was the last of the anointed class. So they didn't have anywhere to go. So throughout the 20s, they didn't wait and hang on like a lot of Bible students did. They didn't know where to go. And in the mid-1930s, my grandmother, she was, when she was 12, she had an interview with Charles Taze Russell about whether or not she should consecrate and be baptized for the 144,000 because they expected the end of the world. 1914 had come and gone, and there were a couple of new dates. 1915 was thrown out, 1918 was thrown out. by Russell, suggesting that's when the kingdom would begin, that Armageddon would start, kingdoms would be overthrown. They thought it'd be a quick work, and that the kingdom would be initiated. So my great-grandmother, being concerned that my grandmother, who's still 12, only a child, would miss this opportunity for being part of the high calling, as for an interview for my grandmother with Russell, and he granted it. And it was about a 10-minute long discussion, a closed door. Sat her on his knee. She said he stroked her hair and asked her if she liked to play with dolls, and she said yes. And so he took her, escorted her back out, and told my great-grandmother that my grandmother wasn't ready yet for consecration. And then shortly after, I think it was within the next year or so, he passed on. And so they left the Bible students, and it wasn't until the 1930s. My grandmother was married my grandfather. My grandfather was born and raised Presbyterian, and he really didn't have much of an inclination towards religion at all when he had met her. They met in a Spanish class. They were both taking a course, a self-betterment course, I guess, and that's how they met in the 1920s. And they were married in 1925. My grandma and my mother was born in 1926. And so around the mid-1930s, a Jehovah's Witness came to the door of their apartment in the middle of the Depression, and handed my grandmother a tract, I guess, and talked with her, and she said, "Wow, this sounds like the truth I remember as a child." And she got excited. We found the Truth Brethren again, and so she quickly contacted my great-grandmother and told her about these Jehovah's Witnesses that came to the door. And my great-grandmother, being a Scot, she was a thick brogue. You stay away from those people. Those aren't the truth. They don't have the truth. And so my grandmother didn't. She heeded her mother's word, as that this wasn't the real truth. And I guess my great-grandmother, the story, everything gets kind of romanticized, but my great-grandmother apparently started a very sad nostalgia swept over her, and she went into Brooklyn and started walking around the old neighborhood and where the Bethel was, and reminisced with the good old days with Pastor Russell, and this was sometime in the mid 1930s, 35, 36, and at that time, the dawn was Washington Street, 126 Washington Street in Brooklyn, Washington Heights area, near the original Watchtower. And in fact, there were stories about running into the Watchtower Brethren. The Bethel Brethren, and the Watchtower, they were instructed not to have anything to do with their former, the Bible students that had left Watchtower because they were disloyal, and they practiced shunning. As an official policy, maybe they didn't. It was 1952. Maybe they were in denial about it as an organization, but they practiced it. Rutherford did not want any Jehovah's Witness to interact with a former Bible student. They were to shun them completely, act as if they did not exist. This was a policy, and you could be let go. In fact, Woodworth talked about that in his memoirs, that he was taking a chance by just visiting a PBI class in Brooklyn. He knew that the he was starting to become pretty discontent with Rutherford and what he was doing, and what he was, the doctrines that he was changing and teaching by the late 20s. So he and Dawson decided that they were going to check out the Brooklyn Bible Students Ecclesia that was independent of Watchtower. And they worried about when word got back to the Bethel Brethren what was going to happen to them. And the word did get back, and apparently Rutherford didn't like a number of things. First, he wanted to write the script for Frank and Ernest, and that was something Woodworth refused to go along with. And they also admitted to having attended the PBI class. And so Rutherford got the board of directors of Watchtower together and called Woodworth back an hour later. And in his office, they discussed these things, and he was officially disfellowshipped, thrown out. They wouldn't even allow him to eat lunch. This was all in the morning, and he didn't have time to do anything but just gather his belongings, and he was out on the street. My throat. So Woodworth began to meet with the Brooklyn Ecclesia and began motivating them to take action, that there were a lot of brethren that were disenfranchised. And so he organized the Frank and Ernest program to mainly gather those disenfranchised back out. And as a result of that, there was a magazine, follow-up magazine, that was printed to the radio programs. There were 13 radio programs broadcast in 1932. And it was called Radio Echoes, but then they ran out of funds. Nobody had money in the 1930s, but they were able to have enough funding to maintain the printing of the magazine. So they renamed the magazine Dawn, and I showed a copy of an early Dawn magazine, and they began printing it in 126 Washington Street. And they were there for a couple of years until about 1936, where they had to move to Fulton Street. Now, it was on Fulton Street in, I think, 1936. That's where my grandmother, she was great-grandmother, as she was walking down the streets of Brooklyn, sadly reminiscing over the days, bygone days of Pastor Russell and Shangri-La or Camelot, and she was looking into the windows of the buildings as she passed by, and she noticed the set of volumes in the window, and that surprised her because the Watchtower had stopped publishing the volumes in 1927. She looked in further into the building, and she saw Norman Woodworth and Martin Mitchell, and she saw a number of Bible students that she remembered from the old days. And so she went in, and there was a joyous reunion, and my great-grandmother then told my grandmother, and my grandmother then started that she found the truth again. And then my grandmother began to attend meetings, the Sunday meetings in Brooklyn, and also there were midweek meetings in Martin and Irene Mitchell's home in Long Island. And my grandparents were living in, I believe it was Babylon, Long Island at the time. And like I said, my grandfather was a banker, and he was not very interested in in religion at all. He did drive my grandmother and mother to these meetings. My mother was a teenager by then, or preteen, just a young girl, but she attended the meetings with my grandmother. And my mom, she would tell the story that my grandmother would leave literature all around the house, and my grandfather would sneak read it. He would never read it while she was present, but while she wasn't around, he'd glance at it. And then the story goes, they were home one night during one of the midweek meetings. It was a special meeting, and Norman Woodworth was giving a public talk. But it was raining like cats and dogs that night. And so my grandmother didn't, because what would happen when my grandfather would take her to the meetings, he'd sit in the car and wait. I guess he'd listen to the radio. I don't know. I think they had, some cars had radios in them in those days. And he'd just sit and wait out in the car until the meeting was over, and then he'd take her home. Well, she didn't want him to go out and sit in the car in the rain on this dreadful night. And so nothing was said during dinner. And after dinner was done, it was very melodramatic. My grandfather, my mother always used to get teary over this, put his hands down on the table and, well, are we going to go hear that guy or not? And so they got in the car and they went to the meeting, and that's where my grandfather became converted. And he became a very, very close friend of Norman Woodworth. He very much respected Woodworth. My grandmother, and here's some, I'm going to put some photographs on it. This is Norman Woodworth. Not used to working in a mirror. And his wife, second wife, she was Swiss, and she was also a masseuse. I knew her. She gave me actually a little Swiss cap when I was about 3 years old. Had a Swiss cross on it. That was their home in Rutherford, New Jersey, and he headed up the Dawn. My grandmother, this was her. When she consecrated and baptized in the late 1930s, she was about 36 there, became Norman Woodworth's private secretary at the Dawn. So this is at the Dawn, and I believe this may be, this was before they moved to Rutherford, I suspect, because Woodworth's office moved to 37 Wilson. I used to crawl around under his desk. My mother would fill in as my grandmother's alternate when my grandmother had something to do and she couldn't work for Woodworth. My mother would fill in as his secretary. Yet I was just a baby, and so she would bring me, and I would crawl under his desk while he was writing his articles. So you see, I was in the heart of this. I never really realized how much my family was in the midst of this religion. Now, I showed you a picture of my grandmother back then. This is a photo. We recently went through photos and found some. That's my grandfather, Felix Wassman. He was a banker, and I'll tell you a little about him. But he was my maternal grandfather, and they both were immersed together. My grandparents were both immersed in 1938, and that's when she began to work as Woodworth's secretary. She worked for him until I think 1964, and then Uh, both that was the year my grandfather retired, and they moved to Clearwater Beach, Florida. And while I'm digging around, my grandfather actually he made a number. I think I might have said this, but he made a number of Bible students pretty wealthy because he had a prestigious job. Now he got a job with the oldest bank in New York. It was called the Bank for Savings. It was the first bank in New York City after independence, after New York, the New World, the United States became independent of Britain. They needed a bank, and the Bank for Savings was the first bank in New York, and their insignia, or whatever you want to call it, icon, was they were called the Beehive Bank, and because bees saved up and accumulated honey, and they had these old basket-shaped hives. Beekeepers used to have basket. Now today they're boxes with trays. Back in the early days, they were sort of a woven basket, and the bees would build their hive inside and this basket, and that's how beekeepers would keep them. And that was the icon for the Bank of New York, or Bank of this new Bank for Savings, New York Bank for Savings. No, not later, after a merger, it was called New York Bank for Savings, but the Bank for Savings in New York. In 1957, I think they merged with the New York Savings Bank, and it became the New York Bank for Savings. So my grandfather, he retired in 1964, but he got a job in the early 1930s with them at Christmas. It was a 2-week job, handing out. It was in the worst part of the Depression. They had moved from Rochester, New York. He lost his job as a bookkeeper in Rochester, and he moved down to New York City, where his brother George offered to my grandfather and grandmother to come live with them. My uncle George, great uncle George, and Aunt Bee. And my grandfather never forgot that kindness his brother showed him. And George, I don't know how my grandfather found out about the job, but anyway, it was around Christmas, and he had no money to buy Christmas presents for my mom and grandmother, and he felt pretty badly about that, and he got a job with the Bank for Savings, a 2-week job, handing out calendars to up and down the street to businesses in the vicinity of the bank. And my great grandfather, August, and he's an interesting guy, and I'll maybe someday I'll talk about him. Held 7 patents. But I'll go on. In fact, Honda cited my great grandfather, his patent for an engine they used in the 1970s. But anyway, my great grandfather worked for the Bank for Savings as a bookkeeper, and knowing that he was ready to retire and my grandfather needed a job, he talked with bank management after the 2 weeks was up, and he asked if he retired, could they hire my grandfather in his place, and they agreed to do that. And then my grandfather got a permanent job with the Bank for Savings, and he stayed with them throughout the rest of his career. He retired in 1964. 1957, he had 25 years with the bank, so you got to go back. So it was 1932 when he started with the bank, and he retired in 1964, which was 7 years after his 25th anniversary. So he worked for the bank for 32 years. In that time, he climbed his way up to executive vice president. He was in charge of making it, whether or not they should invest in a particular project. And at the time, it was federal projects. Grand Coulee Dam, the Delaware Memorial Bridges. I remember him talking about, and he had to travel as a part of his job, and so he decided to get a camera, and for several reasons. First off, he didn't know if he was going to have grandchildren or not, but he suspected that they would. My mother and father were married in 1948. And he also was going to all these beautiful places in the United States, and he had a little extra time, and he visited many of the national parks. He would take time on his own and go to these national parks, and he took wonderful photos. He had an amazing eye. He was a real artist. He could also hand draw. He wasn't trained, but he was just naturally talented. And we do have some of those hand drawings. My daughter, who is an artist, trained artist, is amazed at his talent. But anyway, he bought a camera, and he took literally thousands of slides of Bible students, conventions. There were many slides of family, us when we were growing up, and my brothers and me, and many of the Bible students conventions, especially the General Convention and the Detroit Convention, because they had many friends in Detroit, very close friends. So anyway, to show you how my grandfather, he worked, his boss was William Howard Taft II. You see what these things are? These are nameplates you put on your desk, and you walk into their office and you know who they are. Well, this was my grandfather's boss. There you can. William Howard Taft II. He was the nephew of William Howard Taft, the president. This was my grandfather's desk name tag, whatever you want. Don't have much of his stuff anymore, but that just some interesting little things. He was a pallbearer at William Howard Taft. One time my grandfather took me to Sagamore in Long Island in Oyster Bay to see the home of Teddy Roosevelt. And a lot of the blue bloods, the aristocratic blue blood, the Carnegies, the Roosevelts, the Fords, the Vanderbilts, and all of them. Many of their children, like William Vanderbilt, the son of Cornelius, went into banking. And so my grandfather knew many of these people, including Kennedy. Kennedy was the one that was chosen by Roosevelt, Joe Kennedy, to help reform the stock market and the problems that caused the stock market to crash in 1929. So my grandfather, he ran in some interesting circles and knew some people. When I was 13 years old, we went to Sagamore. My grandfather took me there, and we walked through the house. It was now a museum of Theodore Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt had a number of sons. One of them was a banker, and Archibald Roosevelt. And my grandfather, there were pictures, photographs of the family in Sagamore, and my grandfather, oh, there's Archie. He called him Archie. He knew Archibald Roosevelt, the son of Theodore Roosevelt. If I only knew a little more. My grandfather made some Bible students rich. There was one Bible student in particular who's also he was a noted speaker in the 1927 yearbook, 28 yearbook, 29 yearbook. G.R. Pollock. Russell Pollock. He left the Watchtower in the late 20s, 1928, along with Woodworth and Dawson and a whole bunch of others. I had gone through how many, the wholesale changeover. It was more than 25% of the Pilgrim speakers list was missing between 28 and 1930. There was a wholesale changeover, and it was more than like 40%. 40% of the speakers were gone from that list, and they were replaced with other names. So, my grandfather, Russell Pollock, was an independent building contractor in Los Angeles, and I mean, he was successful, but he really made his money on the investment advice of my grandfather. My grandfather made a number of Bible students rich with his financial assistance. You know, he made recommendations. He never made our family rich. Let's put it that way. He told me that he believed it was an ethical thing. And he had the opportunity to make himself a millionaire a number of times with the investment knowledge that he had, especially with regard to properties that were in foreclosure and that he could have bought for pennies on the dollar and could have sold for large amounts of money. But he had opportunities and even offers to do so, but he didn't feel it was ethical, and he didn't want to cause trouble, and so he didn't take advantage of it. Subsequently, I was not born rich, and they lived well. My grandparents lived well. Now, my brothers and I, my two younger brothers and I was the oldest of three boys, were the only grandchildren of Wassman and. It's not raining. No. I'm looking back and I see sort of a haze. Often that means rain's coming. So there were a number of Bible students that he literally made into millionaires back in the 50s and 60s. And Pollock, to his credit, well, I don't know if it's to his credit, but he funded the Dawn. And he had subsequently a large voice in the Dawn and a prominent position among the Bible students. He was a very powerful man, powerful speaker, took control. He was a real leader. You knew when he was in the room. He took the center of attention. You'll kind of see what I mean when I show pictures. Now, when I talk about pictures, my grandfather, for decades, I had my grandfather's slides up in the attic, and they're troublesome. Slides are, first off, you need a working slide projector, and the bulb burned out years ago. It's hard to get a bulb, and they're expensive. Boy, I'm itching. And just the sheer numbers of them, I couldn't do anything with them. About a year ago, my cousin offered. I have one cousin now. Most of my family, they remained in the Bible students. I'm a defector. I'm a dissenter. That's it. Okay, everybody. Always was the black sheep. I guess I am the black sheep. But there's good reason to be an atheist. There's just the soundest reason in the world. Genesis is not, but I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to be tempted. I'm not going to be shamed into justifying my atheism. Instead, I'm just going to continue and try to, as objectively as possible, give information about the Bible students, which was the intent of my series here. So, again, these thousands and thousands of slides. I finally, my dear wife, climbed up in the attic and pulled all these boxes out. Now I'm nearing retirement. In the next who knows couple of years, I'm getting up there. I can't keep things. We're going to have to move to a more cost-efficient situation, and that means that all of the things that I have kept and accumulated over the years are going to have to be redistributed, and I can't afford to keep 15 boxes of thousands of slides. So my cousin very generously offered to digitize them. He is one of the smarter of us first generation Bible. Let's put it the first generation of my family. When I say there's my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, they are the patriarchs of the family. Then they had 4 children. My father was one of 4. He was the oldest son. He had an older sister. He had a younger brother and a youngest sister. Now, my cousin is the youngest son of my dad's youngest sister, youngest sibling, and he and his brother are, like me and my brother, are no longer Bible students. Unlike his brother and my brother, he's willing to talk about the past, and he and I dialogue about it. And I mean, he was actually the first one to see things for the way they really were. It took me a long time to get this stuff lodged out of my head as being the truth. Admittedly, he was the smart one. He was the one. But anything I've ever seen about from atheists, everybody laments about how long it took them to make to see what the reality is, and everybody berates themselves. And that's the terrible thing about religion, especially religions like the Bible students. They shame you. And the Bible students do it through their admiration of their unique culture, because they stand aside. They stand uniquely amongst Christian organizations. They're outside of that sphere of fundamental mainstream Christianity because of their doctrines. And so the persecution complex, the separation of the world or from the world, and they're very proud of their heritage. And so there's a double shaming that goes on, because how do you abandon the truth, your heritage? And I've been I can't say berated, but let's say chastised, I don't know, by a number of people for abandoning the faith of my youth. But when you think about it, the Bible students are really the orthodoxy. The Watchtower moved on and evolved over time with their doctrines. Their culture kind of was preserved, but their teachings evolved, allowing them to grow into this large organization that it is today, 8 million strong. Maybe they've seen their peak. Maybe they're at the cusp of their growth, and they are on decline now. Who knows? They are the largest revolving door religion right now, with tens of thousands leaving. So they're barely keeping above the growth rate. Maybe they're at a point where they're like Bible students, where it's just the children that really maintain the maintain the body of the organization. But watching the Lloyd Evans, John Cedars channel the other day, and he talked about the convention, he had mentioned that there were only 3 baptisms out of 2,000 in attendance. And if you look at that ratio, 3 to 2,000, and you multiply that against 8 million, that only gives about 10 to 20,000 Jehovah's or new baptized Jehovah's Witnesses. That may have been, an abnormality, an aberration in the in that particular convention. So it might not be the norm. They've been reporting somewhere in the neighborhood of 250,000 or so, or it's up in the hundreds of thousands of new converts baptized every year, which means at 1.5% growth that they're, and accounting for the death rate, which is certainly it's going to take a number of people, account for a number of people in the decline of the organization, reducing the numbers of the organization, but certainly not as much as required to maintain a 1.5% growth rate. So there's a big revolving door with tens of thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses leaving the organization every year. And I think Pew indicated that they may be the one with the greatest turnover, the religion with the greatest turnover of any religion in the U.S. And I can understand why. I mean, the leadership, they're not the sharpest tacks in the book. They're in the box. Let's put it that way. So, a big thing among Bible students are conventions. That's a rallying point. In fact, that's really how the modern Bible student movement really got going. The work of the dawn and you see, back in Russell's day, they could rally around that their common, the common factor amongst all ecclesias during Russell's day was Russell, and the Watchtower that published his writings, the work of the Watchtower, and the sponsoring of conventions where they had fellowship. Well, that was a legacy that could be carried on. That became the legacy around which the new movement, because now, back in the 30s, even though the Dawn formed and they needed some form of organization to organize the work of regathering Bible students, they were also wary of the abuse that an organization can have. That what happened to Watchtower could happen to any organization. There was some justification for that fear, and so conventions became really the means by which Bible students really connected with one another. There wasn't another Charles Russell. I mean, Woodworth had a place along with Pollock. They were frontmen. They were notable, but Woodworth was no Russell. He was not the second Russell to the Bible students. He was well respected, highly respected, but he wasn't the Laodicean messenger, and no one was ever going to give anybody that spot. Russell was the seventh trumpet sounded. Russell was the messenger, the last messenger, and what they were doing was a sifting work, and the true brethren got sifted out from the false, the tares of the Watchtower organization, and Rutherford and the tares went off and on their own way, and the Bible students were the true people of God, and they rallied around conventions. Now, a little of my research, the first convention uh, was the 1929 reunion convention, and I showed a photograph of that. Oh, by the way, here, let me. I was just an interesting little sidelight. Jumping back during Russell's time in 1909, when they moved to Brooklyn, they purchased the church of Henry Ward Beecher, who was an abolitionist, a famous abolitionist. They made that the Brooklyn Tabernacle for Watchtower. And here's a photo of that. I know it's a little out of the context, but I just had to throw it in there because I think it's interesting. And this is a photo of the Brooklyn Tabernacle that I could find. That was originally the church of Henry Ward Beecher. And then when it was purchased by Russell, they bought this building as one of the buildings that I guess they use for worship in Brooklyn. Later, they bought the New York Temple, which was in Manhattan and was larger and could hold a greater crowd. And in fact, the first showing of the photodrama of creation was in the New York Temple. But I just wanted to throw that in there because it's a little bit of interesting history. I should have mentioned this in the previous video I did of notable persons. But anyway, this I think is an interesting sidelight. Now back to what I was talking about. Well, anyway, I just wanted to get that in there. There's so much to say, and the thing is that it's been a little hard for me to know how to go about this because I got so much information at this point on the Bible students movement as it regained resurgence in the 30s and 40s, and the importance that conventions played there were a couple of the programs that I found for the 1929 and 1930 reunion conventions, and in that information there was a statement about moving the convention from November to August, because the first reunion convention was in November, held at the Bible House, the original Bible House that where it was prior to the Bethel home in New York, Brooklyn, New York. This convention, in a sense, evolved into the General Convention, which was always held in the summertime, traditionally August. But one of I think there were several of these conventions that were held, and then there were a number of conventions of independent classes. I believe Chicago held some conventions, and it was decided upon that it made sense to have one general convention. And so by the late 1930s, there was a general convention held in Chautauqua, Ohio, and it was a campground. The convention was an open air convention, hot. I understand, hot. It was in August. My family, my mother's family, attended that convention in 1939. 1940. I know they held it in Chautauqua for a little while. I have a photograph here of them at that convention, and I'm going to just put that up. Now, the woman in the center is my grandmother. The gentleman in the background, you can't see him. You can see a little reflection from his glasses. That is my grandfather. My mother's not in this photo. I can't find her. I don't know who the woman is on the left, but the woman on the right, I believe, is my aunt, or who came to be my aunt later on. At least she wears her hair that way, and she has a general shape. Sometimes it's a little hard to recognize somebody when they were young. But anyway, this was taken around 1940 at the Chautauqua Convention. And it was held outdoors under a big tent with open air seating. And I understand it was a pretty hot. But Bible students couldn't afford it. This was an era when Bible students used to travel. If they had a car, they would pack it with, 10 people, and their luggage, and they would all camp out in a brother's house, and then off they would move to the convention. They didn't have a major highway system then, so travel, even from the East Coast to Ohio, could take 2 days or more. But they were very zealous. Let's put it this way. There was a great deal of zeal, a great deal of activity and energy, because they were coming back together again. The fellowship was reforming, and these were brethren of pretty much like mind. And so there was a great deal of zeal, and there was a whole new generation coming up in the Chicago historic. They had what they called the junior Bible students, which were up and coming elders for the Chicago class, and they sought out guidance of the older body of elders who were from Russell's generation. In New York, Woodworth, they instituted, what did they call them? The prophets, the School of Prophets, and my father, as a young man, and a number of the younger elders in that time, in the late 40s and early 50s, were part of the School of Prophets. Gene Burns, my dad, Ken Rawson, and a number of Bible students who became notable in the 1960s and 70s. And on, were educated or trained in the School of Prophets by some of the older Bible students who dated from Russell's era. I don't know where to go. I have so many freaking photos of conventions, but I do want to put them up, despite the fact that nobody watching this is going to know who they are. Except the one point I think I want to make is not only that was my family connected, and to what degree my family was connected, but also the key figures who you can find their names listed in the yearbook. I'm going to put up their photographs of these individuals, like Russell Pollock and Copeland and Jens Copeland and Russell Pollock and Norman Woodworth and Christian Zano. Christian Zano was sent out by the Dawn to anybody who contacted the Dawn during the 1930s. They sent Zano out, and he would organize a new ecclesia around that contact. And so he was critical in forming new ecclesias during the 1930s, throughout the 30s. And so the movement was regathering, reforming, starting the whole new jump start again with a new zeal, with a new emphasis. and with a purpose to stay loyal to Charles Taze Russell's teachings. And that was the key thing, was to stay loyal to Charles Taze Russell. And so I'm going to save that for the next video, because I noticed that I've gone on in this one, but I'm going to pick up with the general conventions. The general conventions, again, they started in Chautauqua. They were outdoors, but then as the Bible students movement really began to gather steam in the mid 1940s, there were 56,000 Bible students. They needed big, pretty big auditoriums for their conventions, and so starting in the late 40s, they moved to Bowling Green, Ohio, to the university there. They met for a number of years there. During the war, they skipped a couple of years because of the Second World War. There were no general conventions. But then in the early 1950s, they moved to Indiana University and remained there for 18 years. And that's where I began. That was my first recollection of General Convention, was at Indiana University. And so I'll pick up there. I think they were there for 18 years at Indiana University, and they had been there. They stayed till 1971. They were there for 18 years, so that's 1953 was when they began meeting at the Indiana University. My grandfather has slides starting 1954. Now, just think about this. This is only 20 years after the Bible students were dispersed and scattered, and were beginning to regather into ecclesias again, separate from Watchtower. So it's really not that long a period. I think back 20 years, and that's the 1990s. That's like yesterday to me. And so that period of time was right, at the peak of the Bible students movement. I think when you stop and you think about it, and the work that Russell did, it really peaked in 1950s. Consequently, in parallel, that also was the peak period of growth for Watchtower. They were growing exponentially at that time. They were beginning to meet in stadiums in 1950, and Yankee Stadium. They always hold out as being the granddaddy of all conventions, because they had like 250,000 people attend that convention. They had to have both Yankee Stadium and the Polo Grounds. Polo Grounds was the stadium where the Brooklyn Dodgers actually played, and they filled both stadiums with Jehovah's Witnesses. But their talks were very much like Bible student talks. It was, if you listen to a Jehovah's Witness in the 1950s and a Bible student in the 1950s, you'd find it very difficult to distinguish between the two. There were finer points, but for the outside person who was not familiar with either organization, they would have thought that they were talking to one and the same. So, now, my cousin has taken the thousands of slides that my grandfather had taken over the course of his life, and he's in the process of digitizing them. I am amazed. He's only had them for several days, and he's already put up hundreds and hundreds of slides on a Google Drive for me. And now I don't know what to do with all the slides, because I'd love to just put up, and they're meaningless to you all. They're meaningless because they're all these Bible students. Now, a number of them are key people. One of them, I believe, is Edna Moyle. She's the daughter-in-law of Olin Moyle, the wife of Peter Moyle. There's Russell Pollock. There's Norman Woodworth. There's all these people. I'm going to show a number of them. I'm going to show the venue, Indiana University. I'm going to show a number of the key Bible students that were instrumental in the regathering of the movement. It's impossible for me. In fact, I found that a lot of the faces were so familiar to me, and I can't remember their names. Now, I know there are Bible students who could probably fill in the gaps for me. I'm not going to ask them, but I do remember quite a few. And a lot of them, because I was from the East Coast, and the General Convention was a Midwest convention. It wasn't even meant to be like a central location in the United States, because people from the West Coast, Bible students from the West Coast, had to travel a long distance to get to the General Convention. And it was no piece of cake for Eastern Bible students. So it was, even though a lot of Eastern Bible students attended, it was mainly a Midwestern convention, and there are quite a few I just never really got to know. I mean, they were familiar faces. Now, at these IU conventions, there could be as many as 1,000. I was actually in 1965, when I was 10 years old, somehow, some way, at the very beginning of the convention, a Bloomington, Indiana newspaper reporter got a hold of my mother and me, and they took our photos, misspelled my name in the caption, but it was an article about the Bible Students' General Convention being held at IU, and we had our photos in the front page of the newspaper, and they mentioned in that article that there were going to be as many as 1,000 in attendance. So that's about right. There were about 1,000 Bible students who attended in the 50s and into the early 60s. The numbers started to decline by the late 60s. There were splits that were responsible for some of that. And by the 70s, there was an old generation that was dying off pretty quickly. And by the 80s, there was a substantial decline in the Bible Students' General Convention. Right now, it's kind of holding steady, and at about 400. I counted a little under 400 this year, a rough estimate at the General Convention. But there is the International Convention, which is being held in August in a couple of weeks, maybe another week, next week actually. And that every year they hold that. The General Convention's number is in decline. But I know that toward the end of the week of the General Convention, the numbers declined tremendously in recent years. In fact, there's a talk that I am going to put up, and I am going to critique, because it's on evolution. It's a pretty scathing talk about those who believe in evolution, given by a Bible student at this, I think it's this last General Convention. It's called A Word to the Wise, and I have a lot to say about that talk. But it's interesting, when he opens up his talk, it's almost a hurt sarcasm. He says, "I'm glad to see all three of you here," and so they were in an auditorium that was empty. He was giving a talk to an empty auditorium. There were probably 100 people online visiting and watching the talk online, but in actual attendance. I think this could be the last general convention that's a week long. They just can't sustain that. But anyway, we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about the general conventions. We'll talk a little about the culture of the convention, about baptism. We got photos that show all that. And then we'll also have a video of my own experience as a Bible student and my feelings and my own experiences to what happened with me and why I no longer am a Bible student. So anyway, I think I've been relatively objective. I might not be so objective when I get to my own story, but when I'm trying to be as objective as I can, as fair. I'm not hopefully making fun of them, although there are some strange things about the Bible students and their culture, such as the love feast, and that's something that I will show in the. No, it's not dirty. It sounds like pornography, love feast. No, it was a practice of Bible students. After the end of a convention, they would form a line, and everybody would sing God Be With You and shake everybody's hand, all the speakers in a line. And then afterwards they would, there's a brother holding a tray of bread, all cut up in cubes, and you were breaking bread, and it's a tradition. So anyway, that's called a love feast, and it would go on for an hour, but we'll go into all that later on. I've gone way too long, sorry, but once I get started on this stuff, it's a little hard to stop. And anyway, I hope you find this somewhat interesting, and we'll pick up on who are the Bible students in my next video. So talk with you all later. The next video is going to be more intensive in photographs, and these will be my grandfather's photographs, and thanks to my cousin who so graciously is helping me out with digitizing my grandfather's slides. I just can't thank him enough. He's done so much. I'm reluctant to say his name without his permission. Maybe he will give me permission. I don't know. But anyway, I thank him. He may even show up in a photograph that I show. You won't recognize him though. Anyway, this is Truth Seeker saying so long to everybody, and thank you for listening.